Julia and Gauri, who helped organize this. So I'm so delighted to welcome Ed Hirsch back to Boston College and to the Clough Center. Ed has published 10 collections of poems, including his most recent collection, Stranger by Night. A MacArthur Fellow, his poetry has been widely recognized, including an Academy of Arts and Letters Award, an Ingram Merrill Foundation Award, and the Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome. He's been awarded fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation, where they liked him so much they made him president. Ed has also published 6 prose books about poetry, including his new book, 100 Poems to Break Your Heart, and that'll be the subject of our next conversation on April 20th, if you want to mark your calendars. As you'll see both in his books and tonight in this conversation, Ed is an absolutely amazing teacher. He has taught for many years, including at the University of Houston, where we met, and from 2014 to 2016, he moderated a series of conversations on the arts and their role in sustaining the culture of democracy. We're so glad he's willing to come back for some further conversation and exploration of these themes after what has been a tumultuous 5 years. So we're sort of virtually clapping. Welcome, Ed. Thank you so much. And then I guess my first question, Ed, is I know you've been working on this new book about American poetry, and you said you've been doing some more thinking since the series about the role of poetry in democracy. And can you tell us more about that?
Has anything happened since we saw each other last?
A few things, yeah. I feel like there was an election or two.
Yeah, something happened since 2014, and I'll say that.
Yeah.
So, Kim, stop me if I get going here. I really don't want to lecture. I really want to have a talk, but I've been really thinking hard about where we are in the last year. Well, I don't have to tell everyone what's happened, but I'll just say from my perspective, we were suddenly grappling with 3 viruses. The first was the virus that shut down the entire world. We all know that, COVID-19, and it created an unprecedented strangeness and a collect of isolation. And I myself have been safe, but the anxiety and the worry's been everywhere. The mounting deaths, which we have not reckoned with, in my opinion, and the cost is going to be very high because we have not mourned. And people have been so eager to start the economy again that they haven't thought really hard about all the people that we've lost, except the people that have lost them most intimately. Another virus also rematerialized, and that was the virus of racism, individual and institutional, systemic, a sickness unleashed. It's always been there in our country. It's part of the historical DNA in the United States. It's baked into our history, but it also came roaring to the surface in a new way again, and we couldn't ignore it. No one could ignore it, given the police brutalities and murders and the Black Lives Matter movement. And then the third virus, in my opinion, was a sustained authoritarian threat to democracy that's bedeviled American life. There were so many things that I, for one, took for granted that turned out to be norms, not laws. I thought they were laws, but they were norms. And we were completely unprepared, in my opinion, when someone just came along and crashed that. And I was naive. I thought that the kind of native populism, I thought that the kind of virulent white supremacy and anti-Semitism, I thought that was off in the corners, and that this kind of populism was for Poland and Hungary and countries like that. It turns out not to be the case. There are millions and millions of Americans who are like this. And I was caught off guard. So we all went into isolation. I'm running a foundation, so I have a day job. But I had written a book called 100 Poems to Break Your Heart, and I'd been thinking hard about poetry and grief. But I decided that what could I do? what was in my wheelhouse? How could I respond? And I decided that I would respond by writing a book about American poetry and rethinking from the start how poetry operates in democracy and what American poetry is and what it could do. And I basically wanted to elate myself. I wanted to sort of reckon with this. And anyone who knows me know that I'm fanatic about my own library, and I was writing without my library. So I took Eric Auerbach's Mimesis as a model. I mean, I had the internet, he did not. But I decided to try and write a book without my library and try to think through things for myself about American poetry and what it would be in a democracy, and see what kinds of conclusions I could come to. So should I keep going here?
Yeah.
So the first thing that came back to me is when I was 20 years old, I was spending a summer working on the railroad as a brakeman, and I was looking to learn something more about American poetry, and I stumbled on Hayden Carruth's anthology, which he edited, called The Voice That Is Great Within Us. And the line comes from Wallace Stevens. It's two lines from Evening Without Angels. I mean, I'd heard about Wallace Stevens. I'd read a couple of his poems anthology, but I didn't really know. But the lines have stayed with me for 50 years. Where the voice that is in us makes a true response, where the voice that is great within us rises up. And the thing that struck me even then, but came back to me all these years later, is he doesn't say the voice that is great within me. He says the voice that is great within us rises up. And so I thought, well, what is that? What is that voice? What is that larger project? What is that great thing that rises up in us as a commons? And how does that operate in American poetry, which is both very old and very new? It's very new because democracy is fairly new, and we're a fairly new country in one sense. And I'd say that American poetry is as up to date as a poem posted on Twitter, 17 letters at a time. But it's also very old. When I was in school, it was taught that American poetry began with colonialism. But in fact, it begins with the poetry of native nations. It goes back tens of millions of years, probably back to the Paleolithic, and tribal tales and stories of trickster figures like Coyote and Raven, figures like that. And so there's this very oral undergirding of an ancient oral poetry, and then there's the kind of all the way this line to social media. So what I can't really give you the history of American poetry in my rethinking of it, but I want to give you a couple of examples of what I think a new possibility in world literature presented. And that there is what Whitman called democratic vistas, a promise, an idea, an ideal of the republic. And behind that is something we all understand about American life, which is we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that ideal keeps resurfacing in American poetry because it keeps resurfacing in American life. And because we keep letting ourselves down, because we keep failing the ideal, because we keep falling short of our core values. And because my mode, my vocation is for poetry, I'm following this dialogue within American poetry itself. It's a kind of, I would say, American poetry is a history of statement and counterstatement, a process of addition and revision. It's a reclamation. It's, forgive me for saying so, a kind of family quarrel. My sisters found this very amusing because I was telling one of my sisters that American poetry is like a family around Thanksgiving. Okay, sometimes it gets heated and people go storming off in different directions. And they said, "Yeah, I wonder where you got that. Where you got that image from." So, yeah, it can get nasty, but but it is a family quarrel. And so what I want to do is just give you a couple of examples of what I mean about the family quarrel, what I mean about the statement and the counter statement. And behind this is a kind of dialectic. And so I'm going to start with Whitman, but I'm going to start with two lines of Whitman. Oneself I sing, a single separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse. So that's very odd. I mean, he splits himself off. Oneself I sing. I'm a single separate person. But what does he do with that being a separate person? He utters the word democratic. He utters the word en masse. He takes these French words, démocratique, and he takes en masse, which in a mass, and he speaks to the polis. He speaks to the community. What I say as a single separate person is that I'm with you. And this is the Whitmanian gesture, that the song of myself is the song of everyone else. So do you think, I want to mention the poem, I Hear America Singing. But Kim, do you think people know it, or I need to read it?
I think people like you to read it, Eddie. I think you should.
So what I want to suggest to you when I read this poem, which you probably all know, is that no one had ever sounded like this before. This is a new thing in the history of literature. No one, maybe Wordsworth to some extent, maybe Blake in a moment, no one had sort of street level and talked like this. I hear America singing the varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be blithe and strong. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam. The mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work. The boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat. The deckhand singing on the steamboat deck. The shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench. The hatter singing as he stands. The woodcutter's song. The plowboy's on his way in the morning or at noon, intermission or at sundown. The delicious singing of the mother, of the young wife at work, of the girl sewing or washing. Each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. The day what belongs to the day, at night the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths their strong melodious songs. So this is a kind of anthemic work song. It's a kind of catalog of individual singing and songsters. Everyone is sort of represented by their profession, by their job. It's pretty masculine. I mean, he finally does remember to include women. It takes him a little while to get there. He finally gets the mother, but he also gets the wife. He gets the girl sewing and washing. I mean, he doesn't do terrifically well on that score, but he does remember to include women. And the individuals there stand for the whole. And the idea is that everyone in the industrious, the robust working class is going to be included. And that this is Whitman who's singing for. I mean, there's a lot more to say about this and about Whitman, but I'm going to hold that for a moment to say there's a promise there that Whitman makes that he's including everyone. About, the varied carols I hear. It's a commitment to variousness. It's not a commitment to sameness and to the different work that people are doing. But does this include everyone? Does it incorporate Black people who, after slavery, continued to suffer from Jim Crow and segregation and exclusion? Where's the nation that Whitman promised? And some, 60 or 70 years later, Langston Hughes came along and he felt that Whitman needed a 20th century update. Hughes had been tramping around the world. He'd gone to Europe. A lot of African-American artists have gone to Paris and did go to Paris. They felt more human there, especially jazz players, but poets too, fiction writers. They were treated better. And Langston Hughes was working a kitchen in Montmartre and doing various odd jobs and working as the front man. And then he went down to Genoa, Italy, and he was broke. And when he was there, he was thinking about home, and he penned a kind of flamboyant rejoinder called I Too. I too sing America. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. Well, I don't want to do a full analysis of this poem, but you notice that he does begin, I too sing America, and he ends, I too am America. And he also says, I am the darker brother. This is where I'm getting the idea of the family archive. He doesn't say, I am the enemy within, or I am the true resident, you're not. He doesn't say, I'm going to put you in the kitchen. He says, I'm going to come out of the kitchen, and I'm going to sit at the table, and you're going to be ashamed, and we're going to sit there together when company comes, and you'll see how it is, how beautiful I am. And you're going to be ashamed of the way you treated me. And this is what I mean by the corrective, that built into the Whitman poem, I Sing America, is the promise or the premise that someone can come along and say, I too am America, I too sing America. And this is the statement and counterstatement that I see at the heart of American poetry. And this is where I began to see it everywhere, the promise and the corrective in the family archive. I mean, Michael Harper, who was a friend of mine, used to say that you earn your way into American poetry, you earn your way into the archive by eloquence. That no one is born into American poetry. You have to earn your way there by what you sing, by what you learn, by what you study. And the examples of the revisionary quality of American poetry are everywhere. So to give you one small example, I'm going to focus on Emma Lazarus in a second, but just to give you one small example, probably T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland may be the greatest or most important poem of the 20th century, certainly the first half of the 20th century. Eliot really invented a collage method that was unprecedented and had a worldwide influence. He could not have anticipated that many years later, Robert Hayden would come along and take the exact structure of collage that Eliot used and write the poem Middle Passage, which is the first great African-American poetry poem about slavery. He used the collage method and repurposed it. And it was not just the subject matter, it was the very structure of it. And what's extraordinary about that poem in particular is the way that he speaks mostly from diaries and logs and letters of the slavers themselves, as if to impress upon us that history is written by the victors and that he's speaking back to that. So I want to give you one more example of this, and then we'll continue of what I'm talking about. Emma Lazarus wrote the new Colossus on a commission, which you all know from the lines that are inscribed on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. I mean, most people don't actually know the poem. The poem is underread, but the lines about "Give me your tired, you're poor" are very famous. Emma Lazarus wrote the new Colossus, which suggests that there was an old Colossus. And the poem, which is a Petrarchan sonnet, I'm not going to read the whole poem, but it begins, not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Well, that's an interesting argument. She goes, well, our new Colossus is not like the old Colossus. And what she's referring to is the old Colossus of Rhodes, this tremendous, one of the seven wonders of the world, this tremendous giant statue that guarded Rhodes, a sign of tyranny and empire, and says, no one comes to our shores. If you try to breach our borders, we will kill you. That we are the imperial power, don't try it, stay out. And Emma Lazarus, who was very involved with the cause of Russian Jewish refugees, decided to read the Statue of Liberty as an alternative, as a welcoming female presence, as opposed to this patriarchal power. And that's where the statue comes up and says, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. Now, I just want to point out that she was writing at a time when the pro-immigration stance cannot be taken for granted. There was a rabid nativist backlash against foreigners and incredible backlash of typical, characteristic, historically racist American policies, like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And she was determined to do something for people on the lower rung. And she was a follower of someone named Henry George, who wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, which proposed to solve the problem of income inequality by taxing landowners and using money for the public good. She even wrote a poem called Progress and Poverty, which George was just stunned by because he was a social scientist. He couldn't believe that Georgism had found its space in a poem.
Ed, can I ask you a question too,
Yeah.
right here? Which is, what I hear you saying is that in a certain way, the poets are doing a sort of revision of our sort of political imagination, and it's constantly needing to be revisited and re-envisioned as we sort of understand new possibilities. And I'm remembering something that you said once about that there's always this sort of double axis between what the individual is doing in terms of the relationship from the individual to sort of the transcendent and inside that one individual, and a sort of sense of the community. And I wondered if this was the place to also talk a little bit about that relationship, because I think, you know, we're in a moment right now where, just talking to young writers or fellow writers, that the question is, how much can I afford? Is it an indulgence almost to be dealing in these questions of where am I individually, as opposed to where am I in the collective? And I think, you know, when you're talking about someone like Emma Lazarus, that's somebody who's known for what she says for the collective, but maybe not so much for what she's developing individually. Whitman, it sounds like, is meeting both. And I know you have some thoughts also on Emily Dickinson, who in a certain way is also meeting both in a particular way too. I'm going to share a little bit about that, either about the axis or about Dickinson.
What I mean by the axis is that the way I see it, that poetry. Well, first of all, I want to say that there is this corrective, that you were correct about that, and that poetry responds to social issues. But what I'm also trying to say is it also responds to poetic issues, and that there's a conversation going on with American society, but there's also a conversation with American poetry. It's a corrective in response to the poetic tradition as we create one. What you're talking about, the axis, is something a little different. What I would say, what I mean by the vertical and the horizontal, is the horizontal are social issues. And that's what we're talking about with Emma Lazarus. We're talking about the plight of refugees, and Emma Lazarus is a struggle to try and incorporate an American ideology that can incorporate these people, which we're not taking for granted. And I'm going to give you an example of how this came back in the Trump administration, because it's very strong. I don't want to leave this about the Statue of Liberty, because this is not decided. Because I was stunned to hear this on NPR in 2017 to talk about the new Colossus. I'm going to come back to that. But since you asked, what I mean by the vertical and horizontal, the horizontal is social, but what I mean by the vertical are questions of metaphysics, like my relationship to myself and my relationship to my God, my relationship to eternal questions of beauty, of nature, of is there anything constant in human life, and questions of, say, individual salvation. And this was absolutely crucial to Emily Dickinson. I mean, Emily Dickinson was more aware. I read a letter from Marianne Moore in 1932 in which she said that Emily Dickinson was more aware of people, of what was going on in her society than anyone gave her credit for. And that she was certainly more aware of what was happening in the Civil War than anyone understood. She was following the news quite closely. But in addition to that, or aside from that, Emily Dickinson was really concerned with questions of individual salvation. And what's really radical about Dickinson, in my opinion, as an American poet in this conversation, is that she takes a communal form, the hymn form, which are the values of the collective, and which, after all, you pray together, you sing hymns together. It's not an individual form. And she fractures it so that you can't sing it. She constantly uses that 4/3 beat, but she changes it to make questions of her own individual salvation more important than the community. That's what I call vertical. It has a radical social element. And in fact, it breaks the patriarchy in ways that we now see are radical. It sort of breaks poetry as radically as Whitman does in ways we didn't quite understand till much later. But it is, what she does argue is that she calls eternity the flood subject. Meaning it's overwhelming to think about individual salvation. And this flood subject is crucial to her, and she insists that this is of the greatest value and import. And so, for example, in 1862 and 1863, when she was writing mostly her greatest poems, and she wrote like 800 poems in this 2-year period. It's one of the great moments in American poetry and creativity. During this period, as Brenda Wineapple shows in a terrific book about Thomas Higginson and Emily Dickinson, during this period, she started sending her poems in letters to Higginson at the front. Well, he was like in the battle and reading these letters. And the letters enclosed poems of hers. And the poems use Civil War as a metaphor for the self-divided. And so in a way, she's sort of making the claim that these issues of metaphysics of the divided self, the self against itself, are as absolutely crucial as these other social issues. I mean, she's not writing battle pieces, which is Melville's great book about the Civil War, where each poem is about one of the battles. She's writing poems of individual salvation. And this is what I mean by the vertical axis, about the internal life. Now, you can see that in your emotional life. You can see that in your personal history. You can see that in your question with God, however you want to take it, inwards or upwards. But it's the part of our poetry that we make space for that isn't primarily social.
So as you're saying, it has social repercussions.
That's right.
From Dickinson, because she is critiquing in a way by breaking up that structure, but she's not directly speaking like Lazarus is to the communal.
The reason I think this is important is I believe that poetry goes completely wrong when it gets prescriptive. And there are a lot of poetries and a lot of identity poetries, a lot of poetries around the world at different historical moments, where there's tremendous pressure on poets to write a poetry of engagement. You can see it in, say, communist poetry, where you're required to address certain issues, and then you're required to address certain issues in a certain way. You can see this in, say, American Jewish poetry in the 1930s, where poets are writing for a magazine, a newspaper called New Masses, which, if you want to see a great poet who came out of New Masses, read Muriel Rukeyser, who's really a great documentary poet. But in any case, the pressure on Jewish poets in the 1930s to write working class poems put a tremendous burden on these poets. And a lot of them wrote kind of sweatshop poems, etc. But then someone named Kaja Molodovsky, a terrific Yiddish poet, came along and didn't want to write like that, and was put under tremendous pressure because she didn't want to write sweatshop poems. What she wrote were tremendous Holocaust poems, including one called Merciful God, which is really also quite funny because she goes, merciful God, choose someone else for a change. We don't want to be the chosen people anymore. To me, very amusing. So I'm talking about mostly this social element and revision in terms of the political life of our poetry, which I think is what's especially crucial here. But it's important reminder that in American poetry, we make way for the individual voice, the eccentric voice, the peculiar voice, because we have the poetry of individuality, which was somewhat new and somewhat rare in the world.
So, Eddie, when you talk about the prescriptive, are you talking about that the poets don't want to be hemmed in to have that prescribed to them? Or are you saying that if the voice coming from the poet is too prescriptive to everyone else, that's also a problem?
Both. Whenever people, I mean, poets are very eager to tell other poets how to write too. And it's not just critics laying this down. It's not just social groups. I mean, you understand the pressure here. If you're part of a group that's oppressed, then there's a tremendous pressure on the poet to speak on behalf of that group and to speak for that group, for people that don't otherwise have voices. I get that, and I think it's very important that poets do that. I just want to make sure that if you're not that type, we don't exclude you. I mean, we wouldn't have been doing American poetry a great service if we told Emily Dickinson that she had to write poems like Melville's about Civil War battles. I mean, how would that have helped?
Yeah.
In fact, one of the greatest American poets, withdrew to write her own way.
Yeah.
She also sang from the Charnel House steps, but she did it in her own way. So I just think that there's tremendous pressure for poets to write in a certain political way, and that especially now when social issues are so tremendously prevalent, you can see it in societies all over the place at different times. You go to South Africa and liberation movements, go to Poland and solidarity. There are a lot of places where the prescriptive is very strong because of social movements. And all I just want to make sure is that the history of American poetry and the poetry of democracy doesn't sort of exclude people who do something different, because that also has tremendous value.
I also have a lot of questions, coming from students, coming from there about, the limitations. I know when Evan Boland was here, she was talking about a period of time in Irish poetry where there was sort of the public poet, and that it wasn't necessarily good for their poetry, or maybe even for Irish poetry in general, because there was so much of the sort of prescriptive, you need to speak to the political, that everything got very limited. And the three of you, Kevin Young and you and Evan, ended up saying something that I heard as, that the best way to write a poem, both that's going to last and that's also, both, what, as you said, art and justice, is to begin in the personal and not to speak in abstractions, because you begin in that personal. Have you had other thoughts about that since that time?
I don't know. I really honestly don't understand why so many poets want to write poems that newspaper people can do better. I really just don't see the point. I mean, we need journalism, we need really good reporting, and we need poets who are conscious of social issues. But I really don't see why you'd write poems that other forms can actually do better in terms of explaining things. And so it seems to me that what distinguishes the essay or what distinguishes the journalistic piece is that in poetry something happens in language, and that we include the affective life. And so we help describe what it felt like. I mean, in the history of poetry, if you want to know what it was like socially, you do better to read Balzac, say, to get a feeling for what 19th century Paris is like. But if you want to know what it felt like to walk on the street, you do better to read Baudelaire. And so we, our people, have the, a kind of affective dimension to our communications. And it seems to me that when poetry arises out of the eccentric and the individual life, it's blooded by experience. Now, I myself, not everyone feels this way, but I'm kind of allergic to being lectured to in a poem. I don't like it. I don't like to be assaulted and lectured to. I don't like to be spoken down to. And I don't think people enjoy that much. I don't think they like to be berated. And so to me, poetry that is self-questioning, poetry that is rooted in one's own experience, has greater authority. And that's what Ivan was talking about and Kevin was talking about too. Ivan, especially because there was so much in Irish poetry that was so prescriptive in this way. And the historical events were so overwhelming.
No, I thought Kevin also had this point. I remember he used the example of Auden's poem, the September 1st, 1939, that Auden later changed the last line. And then, but everybody loves the original version, the we must love or die.
We must love one another or die.
Yes. And how, he fought that to the very end. But what we need has been that last line. And we certainly saw that September 11th, everybody was turning to that poem. And so that sometimes you're writing a poem, you're writing it as truly as you can from the inside, but you don't know what its uses will be. So, sitting down with the idea to write a political poem is already something a little bit odd. It's almost like if you're writing your own story, the politics as they are present and you allow them in. But you don't.
Do you remember that poem begins, "I sit in one of the dives." It's totally personal.
Yeah.
The last line in the last stanza is a lot of poets. Marion Moore is an example of that. Robert Lowell's like that. John Crowe Ransom is to a terrible degree. They come along as older people and they're very scolding about their younger selves. They don't like the bad behavior that they exhibited as younger people. And so they're sort of like school marms who correct themselves, and they ruin their poems. Ransom ruined a lot. Lowell took a lot of poems and rewrote them as sonnets. I mean, they're not terrible, but they're not as good as the original ones. Ransom screwed up his poems terribly. And Auden did this because he decided that we must love one another or die is not actually true. So then he changed it to we must love one another and die. And then he decided that's a cliche, and so he just decided the whole thing. But other people, not W.H. Auden, decided, actually, we do believe that we must love one another or die. And that line had become kind of anthemic because even though Auden didn't believe it anymore, they did.
Yes.
And they did it. And Auden, I think, an extraordinary intellectual, but he was misguided there by his later common sense. As he was somewhat ashamed of his earlier excesses.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I'm thinking, Ed, that this is probably enough for people to start have some questions coming up. I know people had already poured in some questions before we even started. So I think we can open it up for Frank to throw some questions to you from the audience.
Okay.
Thank you, Eddie.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks so much, Ed. The questions are piling up. So let me jump in with this one first, which is kind of the two versions of the same question. What's the difference between poems anchored to a particular political moment and those that reverberate beyond historical circumstances? Or put another way, what does it take for a political poem to be both of its time and transcendent?
I wish I could give you the formula on that. I'd love to be able to. And then I go, okay, from now on, I'm going to write permanent poems. I'm not going to write the ones that die as you go. You are onto something there. The question has an answer, and the question implies an answer. But I don't think there's a formula that tells you. But it does raise the question that poetry that's tied to events usually dies with the events. And yet, what is it that makes certain poems survive that moment? The Vietnam War is an incredible test case on this, because it was meaningful to me because I was coming up right then. And everyone was like writing anti-war poems. And I was writing them too. And I think everyone believed in my circles in American poetry that we needed to stop the Vietnam War. And I think it's good that people wrote those poems and they helped stop the war and it was meaningful. But almost no one reads them anymore. You read them in histories of Vietnam, histories about Vietnam, but no one reads them as poems. But there are poems that people read about the Vietnam War. They're poems by veterans. They're poems that people wrote when they came back, like Bruce Weigel and Yusuf Komunyakaa and John Balaban and others that have really been meaningful because I think they were not lectures about, as W.S. Merwin's poem, The Asians Dying. There are a lot of poems about the Asians dying over there, which were written from New York. And it's not that they weren't well-intentioned. It wasn't that they weren't trying to stop Asians from dying over there. It was really important. But once the Vietnam War is over, no one wants to read those poems. And they just all died. And they're part of the history now of poetry. But there are poems that have survived, and I think it's because they were rooted in actual experience. And so a poem has to be an event in language, but when it's rooted in experience, it has, I believe, a better chance. But there's no exact formula. In the history of poetry, there were a tremendous number of poems. One of my friends, when I was teaching at Wasteland University, did an anthology of poems in the 1820s, which were about socialism and the poor working class conditions in London. And he found them in hundreds of journals and put them into an anthology. No one read those poems, but people do read Blake's London. So something has to happen in language that moves beyond the subject matter, that finds some kernel in it. Whether the poet can find it or not is a question, because after all, whether something lives or not is really not up to you as a poet. You can't bake it in because other people will decide that. It's really up to others later whether certain poems survive and survive their moment.
Thanks, Ed. Those two questions came with the pre-submitted questions. I didn't have names with them, but the questions that are coming in, I'm going to mention who's asking as well, so we know. A question from poet Jim Henley, and he asks, if it's not too soon, would you be willing to talk about how Adam Zagajewski negotiated some of this territory, the demands of responding to a compelling political environment and his own personal odyssey at the same time?
That caught me off guard a bit. I'm really not quite. I'll just try and talk about Adam's work a little. I mean, I'm in deep mourning right now, so I'm not really ready to talk about that. I wasn't prepared for that.
Sure, that's fine. And
but I will say that Adam, related to our subject, if I can compose myself a moment, Adam had an idea of that you can see I've borrowed and learned from, called solitude solidarity, or solidarity solitude. And by solidarity, he meant the solidarity movement, but those issues that have to do with civitas, that have to do with community. And if you're from Poland, you can't ignore the fact that two totalitarian powers have taken over your country. First the Germans, then the Soviets. And it's a small country, so you feel the obligation to speak to that. That's solidarity. And that's how Zagajewski started. And those poems of his are not very well remembered. They have a certain kind of energy, but they don't really last the moment. They're not the poems of his we read. The idea of what he called solitude, were what appealed to him about music and beauty and the subject of love and his own vast interior spiritual life. And that he believed that there was a kind of discussion or argument between these two things. that it was healthy for poetry to move between them, that they were correctives for each other, that the solitude of individual makers was a kind of corrective to the civitas, but that the civitas was also a kind of correction to the isolation of poetry, the solitude. Another way of putting this is he also distinguished between ecstasy and irony. And ecstasy was the joy of joining things, of merging, of beauty, of standing in front of a painting. He says, I stood in front of a painting and irony vanished in his self-portrait. And irony is skepticism, critical thinking, philosophical thinking. And he believed that this duality was necessary, and the poetry was in a kind of conversation between ecstasy and irony, and that the self is torn between that, and that a larger poetry is torn between what is eternal in ourselves. That's what I'm calling the vertical. He calls solitude, and the social or historical, which is what he calls solidarity. So, thanks, Jim.
No, thank you. And Ed, you just returned us to the vertical and the horizontal. I have a question here from Robert Pinsky, who is with us. And he asks, does the vertical or horizontal give us insight into the fascism of Ezra Pound, the collective at an extreme?
That guy ought to write some books. He's a smart guy. He's a smart guy. Which maybe it's a good time to say that Robert wrote a really good little book about poetry and oral voice and democracy. And so did Robert Penwarren, wrote a book on poetry and democracy. It's just so tempting because Robert's probably, we never actually talked about, Robert's a friend, we never actually talked about Ezra Pound, I don't think, but I have I mean, my rage against Ezra Pound is just so, it just is like, I mean, it can burst at any time. The thing that Robert is pointing to is that Pound's anti-Semitism was cooked into the poetic. It wasn't just like he had some opinions, it was, or that he said to Allen Ginsberg, it was that stupid anti-Semitic prejudice. No, it's built right into the cantos. It's like cooked into the aestheticism of that thing. Around this issue, I mean, Pound was pagan, and he did rummage through history, but it's the extreme aestheticization, I think, and the dehumanization of people that I think makes the canto such a difficult text. What I mean by baked into the poetic, which is one of my ongoing arguments with Poundians who just like to read the beautiful parts of the cantos and forget the rest, is that I don't have time to go into it, but Pound had crazy economic theories which equated usury with the sun. And so, and because of the sun's connection to gold. So you could be reading a line that's really beautiful about the sun and think you're just reading something great and aesthetic and feel really great about it, with completely forgetting that this image of the sun is tied to an idea of usury and has a kind of historical meaning for Pound and for anyone who reads the canto structurally. And I don't think you can just separate out the beautiful parts from what is an assaultive modernist text, a fascist text, basically.
Thanks, Ed. Let's change it up with a couple of questions from young writers. We have a couple of Kim students who have asked a couple of questions and a recent alum who is also a young writer. And I'll just mention these three together. Morgan Hamill writes, how do you maintain a daily poetic practice even when it seems impossible to write? How do you write when reality seems too much? And then we have Christine Lenahan saying, how do you continuously grapple with the sense of urgency in your writing? a need to convey these political truths through poetry. And finally, an early question from Becca Francesconi. What guidance can you give to students in their writing pursuits who are battling the anti-print attitude of an increasingly technological world?
I don't know how to answer all those questions. Those are really good questions. I'm not sure I have all the answers. First of all, I think you can't try to solve all the problems of society in a poem, and that will paralyze you. You can tell your story. You can begin with your own experiences and see how they connect up with what you observe. You can't stop all the injustices with a single poem. So I'd say that the idea of a daily practice is a good one. Randall Jarrell said that, a poet is someone who stands in the rainstorm. A good poet is someone who gets hit by lightning 12 times. A great poet is someone who gets hit by lightning 6 times. Or no, the opposite. A good poet is someone who gets hit 6 times. A great poet is someone who gets hit 12 times. I mean, you got to stand in the rain, and then maybe you'll get hit. You can't will inspiration, but you can go to work. And there's a sort of certain amount of poetry that takes your lunch pail to work. And what I would say is one way to try to solve the overwhelming burden of the social and the overwhelming burden. I mean, I tried to solve this problem myself by writing a book about American poetry because the culture is just so impinges so much. You can look at other poems that you admire that do something that you think works, and you can try and learn from them. You can try, instead of just trying to address all the social issues, you can say, I like this poem by W.H. Auden. I wonder if there's something I can do with that. And how does he do that? And you don't go very far in Auden's poem, which has a tremendous political consequences, without seeing that the poem is actually written in trimeter. And you go, well, what does that sort of 3-beat line do? That's kind of interesting. Or if you don't like a strict trimeter, maybe you like Philip Levine's poems, which are kind of a looser trimeter, but they're based on the same thing. They're based on early Yeats, or like Yeats's The Fisherman and other poems. This is the line of Elizabeth Bishop's In the Waiting Room and other poems. So if you like that kind of line, then maybe you'd say, well, this line can do something that I can't do in my poems. And that way you don't have to think about all the injustices of the world, which you can't solve. But you can see if by following this way, I sit in a dive and go, well, where do I sit? And how do I reach out from there to see how that operates, and trying it from there as a kind of daily practice. Because you are involved in a conversation about the world, but you're also involved in a conversation about poetry. And it is inevitable that if you're writing poetry, then you have to engage with issues of poetry. If you can ignore them and they will control you, or you can engage them. So I find myself it less troubling to try to think about line breaks, like where a line should break and what that does, and not always think only about my relationship with God, say, or am I doing enough for social causes? So I think that I get the burdens, and I think it's important, and I think it's honorable to think about them. But there's just no way to get out of the fact that you have to learn to go. If you're writing poetry, you have to learn about poetry, and you have to try to find what poetry can do. And I think putting yourself to school, not on the poems that your teachers like, but the poems that you like, and whatever those are. And I personally don't care what they are. I think just finding something that you like is what matters most. That seems, if it's Allen Ginsberg, it's Allen Ginsberg. If it's Yusuf Komunyakaa, it's Yusuf Komunyakaa. I mean, if it's Lucille Clifton, it's Lucille Clifton. If it's Emily Dickinson, it's Emily Dickinson. To me, it doesn't finding the poet that speaks to you is what's most crucial.
Thank you, Ed.
I need to say, Frank, before we do the next question, that we're getting close to the 7 o'clock point. And I know some students have classes and have other places they have to go to. So I wanted to be sure to say we're at that 7 o'clock point. But anyone, Ed has very graciously offered to stay and answer more questions. So if you didn't get your question answered and you really like to, or you just want to stay a little bit longer, Ed's gonna indulge us for a bit longer. So
Kim, now I'm having a flashback to when we were together, because there's nothing like having half the room stand up and walk out of it, in the middle of a sentence. There's nothing more fun than that.
There you go. But luckily you don't have to watch it this time.
Exactly. I'm just gonna,
This is good. So anyone who needs to go, but thank you, Eddie, for continuing from here to answer any questions that you're still hoping he could answer.
Thank you, and thanks. The questions are multiplying, so I'm glad you're willing to stay.
I'm happy to. I'm with you on this.
Great. So a shift to a more technical question from within the poetic practice. Alison Adair, poet here at BC, she asks, and she was here in your audience a couple of years back. The last time you were here, you suggested that when a poet speaks from a perspective of we in a poem, the poem dies. When is we intimate or necessary, and when is it didactic or distancing?
That's a very, very good question. I don't know. Did I tell the story about Wisława Szymborska in this when I told that story? I can't remember, but it came up around this. I was interviewing Wisława Szymborska, and she, after she'd won the Nobel Prize, and she said that after she had written her early poems, she never used we in a poem again. She would never speak from the we. And then, bright student that I am, I said, well, actually, that's not entirely true. There are a few poems that you do use we. I started rattling them off, and she wasn't pleased with me, I'll say. She wasn't pleased with me. There are obviously moments when the Whitman is a moment. There are obviously moments when you can use we, where you can use us, where you can use our. And I don't think there's a prescription. But I think that the question about the we is, are you really including yourself? Or are you really just making a comment? And if you're making a comment from a position, I don't think personally poems work well. The way a lot of political poems go wrong, in my opinion, is they speak from certainty. And I think that uncertainty is more powerful in poems than certainty. A certain wariness about one's opinions is probably practical. And that a lot of poems that speak from we sort of assault you. They kind of lecture you. They go, we believe this, you believe that. We're better than you. There's a very good poem by Thomas Lux called The People of the Other Village, which is us and them, and how everything goes wrong when it's, we did this to them, they did that to us. We nailed rats to their foreheads. It's a surreal poem of revenge back and forth, with a very funny line where you go, we mocked their poets. And when that didn't mean anything, we did something, no one cared that we mocked their poets. Then we mocked their musicians, and people did care. It's very amusing. But the we, when it dehumanizes the individual, I think, and just speaks from a position of authority or power, is probably less effective in poetry. And when the self is genuinely included in the questions that the we are asking as a community, and the voice is really speaking genuinely as part of a group of other people. My sisters and I believe, say, it seems to me that there's no recipe for this, but I think if you've really got skin in the game, then that's more likely to be successful using the plurality rather than if you don't.
So that brings me to a question that Anna Ross asks, which
Just like old times.
is how does the poetry of witness, examples, Akhmatova, Ceylon, how does the poetry of witness tie into the concept of poetic statement and counterstatement? And are we now in a moment of poetic witness?
Yes, I would say that the poetics of witness, yes, we are at a moment like this, and the poetics of witness is absolutely crucial to a kind of poetry of testimony. But what I would say about this is that, no offense to Carolyn Forche, who popularized this idea, because I love her anthology, The Poetry of Witness, and I learned a tremendous amount from it, is the notion of witnessing is very narrow there. And that because witnessing is not just reportage, and that Szymborska is a good example. I mean, Szymborska is writing about things that she experienced, but she's a kind of philosophical or conceptual poet. So she's not like writing about the war that she saw in a direct way, but in fact extrapolating from what she did see. There's an extremely instructive moment about this subject in Czesław Miłosz's work, because there is A. Alvarez wrote a review of one of Miłosz's books in the New York Review of Books. Well, first of all, Miłosz had given the Harvard lectures called The Witness of Poetry. So he had spoken about witnessing in poetry, especially Polish poets who he believed were kind of the crucible of the 20th century because of what they'd lived through. And so that was to him the witness of poetry. So then A. Alvarez writes this review called Witness in the New York Review of Books. And here comes now the next issue. I'm a young poet, I'm reading it. Here's a letter from Czesław Miłosz. And Czesław Miłosz is totally attacking A. Alvarez for this really great review of his book. And the reason Miłosz doesn't like this review is because it's called Witness, and because Miłosz believes that that reduces the poet. That the poet is not a journalist. That the poet is not merely reporting what is going on. The poet is a kind of consciousness. And that this idea of witnessing is too narrow. And so what I would say is, I think the poetry of witnessing is crucial in terms of its social engagement and its historical consciousness. But you would say that in a literal way, Melville is more of a poet of witness when he writes battle pieces than Emily Dickinson is when she writes, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. But she's writing about something that she's experiencing too. And that the nature of experience should not simply be, the notion of witnessing keeps getting narrowed to people who are at the front. And I believe they have a lot to say. But I don't think poetry is only written by people who are at the front taking notes. And it kind of privileges a kind of firsthand experience of certain historical traumas. And I don't mean to minimize that in any way, but those are not the only poems that get written. So Primo Levi wrote a tremendous Holocaust poem called Shema after he'd been in the camps and came back to I mean, that's really the poetry of witness. But Katja Malidowski was in New York in 1947, and she wrote Merciful God, and that's a great Holocaust poem too, but she was not in the camps. But she was reading the reportage of what was going on in Poland, where she still knew a lot of people, and what had happened, where she had come from. And she was, moved to write a poem. So you'd say, well, this is witnessing, but it's at one remove. And it's still a really important poem. It doesn't disallow Shema, Primo Levi's tremendous poem, but it doesn't mean that that's all there is to say, that there are other perspectives. For example, the idea of historical witnessing, you might say, if that's privileged, you might say that historically, that excludes women's poetry. Like, because women were not going to the front. I mean, Akhmatova is a special case. I'm glad to talk about her. She's a tremendous poet, though witnessing is a little more complicated there. When you read Requiem, then it seems. The preface is what is what people talk about when they talk about Requiem, but the whole poem is really much more idiosyncratic. It's a tremendous poem, but it's much more complicated than straight witnessing. It's just that there's a whole, and Evan Boland was very eloquent about this, there's a whole range of experiences that get excluded when you privilege historical witnessing. I mean, Evan's argument was it left out and disallowed women's experiences. It cuts out the domestic. It cuts out, I mean, if you expand witnessing to say childbirth, then that's a different story, but it hasn't historically been viewed that way. So all I'd say is the idea of witnessing as reportage needs to have a corrective to include all kinds of other people's experiences who are not fighting at the front.
I wanted
Just like
to add,
being in class again, Anna.
Eddie, I also wanted to make a connection too, because we were talking earlier about Adam and his thought, and he had this idea of the the way that ideology, that poetry wasn't, he wanted us to resist ideology. And he used to say one of the ways that you do that is you immerse it in what I think he called the goosebumps of the everyday. And I think that's part of that sort of domestic, the everyday, and that keeps things from being inflated. It keeps them grounded, and it keeps from making this sort of exclusionary problem.
It's also good. It also, I mean, I wish I'd thought of that. It's a very good point when I was being asked by younger poets about the overwhelming traumas of the day. There's also quotidian experience. I mean, if you really want to get a good sense of this, you just read Frank O'Hara's lunch poems. I mean, they're really fun, and you got the guy's bopping around New York, and you get a feel for the street and what's that like. And you can almost sort of get a GPS and map it where he's going, and see what he's doing. And it gives you, my experience teaching now at NYU, it's very appealing to younger poets. And it's completely present and to write about daily life with a kind of vivacity. I mean, no one's bopping around quite right now, but daily life it's a touchstone. And this is important for Adam because so many of his poems are kind of levers of transcendence. And one of the things that's just really mysterious about his poems, I wish I could take you through them, is the way they move in a very short space from and pick up speed and build, so you get this sort of quotidian that ends up lifting off. It's just really, it's a remarkable gift that he had for acceleration and liftoff. But it is grounded. I once did a study of poems in the epiphanic mode, poems of tremendous spiritual enlightenment. And what I discovered is they all begin in the most quotidian way, like Elizabeth Bishop's In the Waiting Room in Worcester, Massachusetts. James Wright's in Rochester, Minnesota, his poem, A Blessing. Anthony Heck's A Hill in Italy, where this sort of thing can occur. I had a vision once. There are all these really transcendent poems are very, very grounded in ordinary reality and in daily life. They often have dates on them. They certainly have spaces, places, and that because when you want to get some lift off in a poem, it's much easier to get that lift off if you're lifting off from somewhere. And if you want to see some poems that go wrong because they don't get that, you just look at, say, Yeats's early poems, The Wind Among the Reeds, because he just goes straight to the eternal. I mean, I know Harold Bloom championed those poems, but compared to Yeats's later poems, or as he said, beginning with responsibilities, everyone gets off their stilts. Once everyone gets off their stilts, then you can still get lift off. And that's what Yeats learned to do. sitting in a diner, he has, suddenly the time expands and he feels the blessing. So I think that getting the quotidian and starting in the quotidian and pushing and hoping for the lift off, that works better in poetry than just, seeking the eternal truth.
The poet Gary Whitehead has put in a question that I think is also speaking into this in some way. He's asking, is there a way in which the poet has to stand at the edge of the social political structure, 1 foot inside and 1 foot outside, in order to offer a critique of the polity and to offer some kind of voice of sovereignty to inform and enrich the life of the polity, sometimes by really challenging the direction in which it's going?
The only thing I would say, yes, but the only thing I would say about that is the phrasing has to. Because I think that I'd say that's probably the most powerful place that most people can speak from. And it's probably a good model for most of us. But there are people, Akhmatova was like this in what was then Leningrad, who were speaking from, not from the margin, but from inside the experience. And then there are poets who are speaking from way outside, like Gerard Manley Hopkins, triple remove in Ireland, writing the great, the so-called terrible sonnets, or John Clare writing from a mental institution, or James Schuyler writing the Payne Whitney poems, or Julia de Burgos writing, from Welfare Island, where she was confined for alcoholism. Those are really people outside. And then there are people writing, inside, who are, Wilfred Owen is writing from inside the experience. So I would say for most of it, it's a very good place to be, but people have made a poetic out of being on the inside and the outside too. One of the things I love about Christopher Smart is in his section about his cat, Jeffrey, he has Jeffrey doing all these, these ordinary things, but they have a kind of glow because daily life is so strange, Christopher Smart, because he's so removed from it. He's writing about it as if he's some kind of alien. And Schuyler does that too. And so you'd say they're speaking from the far margins, they're from the far edges of social experience because they're excluded by their mental issues. But for most of us, I think that looking in and looking out and being on the margin is probably the right spot.
Kim's students, Kim had mentioned to me that for a lot of students, and I'm going to the pre-submitted questions here, for a lot of students, Amanda Gorman is their idea of a public poem. And the question is, how do you think Amanda Gorman's inauguration reading and resulting fame will impact the future of poetry in the public eye?
It's hard to know. I'm a little wary, only because after September 11th, I'm old enough to remember after September 11th when suddenly people started circulating poems tremendously. In fact, they were even irritating me because they were all sending me poems that I'd read, since I was in college. Yeats's Easter 1916 and Auden September 1st, 1939. They just discovered them on Twitter that day, and it just was irritating. 40 people sent me W.H. Auden's poem, which I'd been teaching for years. So I was a bit irritated, but the poem did circulate to a wide number of people, and it seemed like there was going to be a change, that now poetry was going to be built into the culture in another kind of way. It turned out not to be true, that it didn't make a lasting, it mattered to people at the time, but they didn't go on suddenly all becoming readers of poetry. I'd like to think that Amanda Gorman's tremendous performance will change things, and that people on CNN were talking about poetry for the first time. Now, will they go on reading other people's poems and responding to other people's poems? Forgive me if I'm skeptical, but I will say that I do think that what will happen is a tremendous number of younger people, especially, are going to be galvanized, have already been galvanized by Amanda Gorman's poem, and have taken up. I personally think it's a spoken word poem. I think it's a marvelous one. And I think that a lot of young people are going to follow spoken word, who already were doing it, and many more will. I think that's a good thing. And I think it's very healthy, and it's good for poetry. Is this going to change the way poetry is viewed in the society? Let's hope so. But forgive me, I'm an American. I'm a bit skeptical about whether that's going to happen. But I would like it to be true, and it certainly had a moment. I mean, everyone is too young now to remember Robert Frost's performance at the Kennedy inauguration, but that was the first time my parents ever saw anyone read a poem, and I was in 7th grade, and my parents thought poetry was really cool for one moment, and then they started saying, "The road not taken. Yeah, you shouldn't take that one. You need to take you need to get on the get on the one that's taken."
I wanted to say something too, especially for people who are teachers or any students who might still be here. There's a wonderful recording of Amanda Gorman. I think she's made it since the inauguration, reading Elizabeth Alexander's poem as a sort of tribute. And that was interesting for them to see. She reads it very differently, much less performatively. It's a very different kind of poem. And just to be able to compare, say, there's, here she is doing this kind of poem, and that can, as a way to start to talk about the formal issues, but also for them to see her doing a sort of tribute to Elizabeth Alexander's poem.
Yeah, and Elizabeth Alexander's, I'll have to look at that because I haven't seen that, but Elizabeth Alexander's poem, and she did read it aloud, but it's a written poem. And it didn't come off nearly as well. It wasn't really written. I mean, it was written for the occasion, but it's not an oral poem. And Amanda Gorman the spoken word turns out to have been the perfect model for this kind of occasion. Whereas most of the poems have been written, translated into being read aloud, and haven't worked. The occasion has overwhelmed them. I mean, Miller Williams read a poem, and now no one even knows what it was, and he had the stage. So I think the spoken word moment came to the podium in a really good way.
Now, this question, and any time if it's time to call it a night, just let us.
Yeah, I'm gonna outlast you, I'm afraid.
Oh, no, that's great news for all the questions that are still left. This is a question again without a name, reaching back to something that you'd said earlier. With Langston Hughes as a corrective, where do you see sort of those corrective poems right now, or corrective moments right now?
I don't have a ready answer to that. I'd have to think through what I mean. I don't have it ready to hand all the poems that are being written right now. I just am not sure. I'm not that tuned in to everything that's being written right now and how it's correct. I mean, I'm aware of this overall social corrections, but what I'm talking about is a correction within poetry, kind of argument within poetry. And I'd have to really see where that I don't have an answer to that offhand. I mean, I've read a lot of poems that are social corrections, but that's not exactly what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is this sort of family revision structurally of a previous poem or a previous statement, to rethink it. I can't, it just
Ed,
doesn't.
would you include maybe some of the things that Joy Harjo is doing in terms of including chant, music, things coming out of the indigenous community back, and she's done that for years, but now she's the poet laureate, our first Native American poet laureate. So would you include that in some way as a sort of revision, at least formally?
Yes, but that's been her whole, I mean, Joy and I are the same age, and I've known her, for 40 years, and she's been doing that. That's her whole work. That's all her work from In Mad Love and War on. So yes, but you couldn't say that. She does have the podium now. And because of that, she did this tremendous anthology of Native Nations poetry, which has really been very interesting to me. And so she does sort of bring a wider consciousness to it, but it has been her project for her whole life. But yes, I think that's it brings in the orality of American poetry and spotlights the long indigenous tradition and tribal traditions of the American poetic. And so in that way, it is an important reminder of where American poetry really starts.
So a question that might be somewhat more mischievous in spirit, again, from the pre-submitted questions. Are there poets or poems that you love and yet regard as deeply anti-democratic?
Yeah, this is really troubling. And I don't blame you if you want to tune out now, because young people don't like this. I'm just going to say it's not, what I'm going to say is not popular. So you're not going to like this. And so, because right now we're all pretty sure that we're correct, that we're right, and that other people are wrong, and that our political positions, which I share, are all right. But historically, it hasn't worked out so well. If you look at the whole history of poetry, you can't say poets have always been on the correct side of issues. It's just impossible to say. I've had a long argument with T.S. Eliot, and because he disappointed me so badly. Because I was crazy for T.S. Eliot when I was young, and I was an apogee of modernism. This is it. The Wasteland is it. And I didn't know anything, and I just was thrilled by T.S. Eliot. And then I started reading his criticism, and then I read Notes on a Christian Society, and he says there that in a Christian society, any large number of free-thinking Jews is undesirable. And I felt personally betrayed. I felt like, really? I just was so shocked that someone that I admired so much could say something like that. And then he goes further, he says that it's fine to have Jews in a Christian society as long as they all wear the same costume. I mean, I was so shocked and so appalled, and I vowed that I would hate T.S. Eliot from then on, and I would just prosecute. The thing is, whenever I start reading the poems, they're so great, I just completely am won over again, especially actually I like most of them. I don't like poems 1920, his most anti-Semitic ones. I think they're quite repellent. But I just wrote an essay about Prufrock. It's an incredible outing for a 21-year-old. I mean, it's just an extraordinary poem. And Four Quartets is one of the great spiritual poems of the 20th century. And The Wasteland is just pulsively readable. But I don't, T.S. Eliot's an anti-Semite. I don't pretend that he's not. And I don't like the anti-Semitism that bubbles up in his work. And I don't like the attitudes. I don't like the snobism. I don't like the misogyny. I don't like the racism. There's a lot about T.S. Eliot I really can't stand. But some of those poems are just dynamite, and they change your spiritual life. I mean, I think Rilke's kind of a prig, and I don't like him. And he's always sucking up to the rich. I mean, Rilke really bugs the shit out of me. Rilke's like the worst parent in the history of poetry. I mean, Rilke's idea of parenting is, leave his daughter for the mother to raise. But Jesus, the Duano elegies are just so great. I mean, it's really a great project. It's really a great work. So there are a lot of poets whose, ideas I don't share, but whose poems I still love. Of course, it's really great when you line up. It's really great when you find out that you love a poet and they share your values. But it's often not the case. And I mean, I learned early on that if I was going to just not read any writers who were anti-Semitic, I wasn't really going to be able to read English literature. Maybe I could read George Eliot. That would be good. But sorry, I wasn't really going to be able to read Henry James. But I love Henry James, and I don't want to read The American Scene. I don't want to read the section of The American Scene where he talks about, Jews, a neighborhood teeming with Jews like insects. I'd rather not read that. But Jesus, The Golden Bowl is a great book. So I don't have to share the politics. I don't like hiding the politics. And sometimes, as in say Eliot's poems 1922 or in the cantos, the repulsive opinions are built in. Other times they're not so built in. Like if you read Philip Larkin's letters, you're going to be endlessly disgusted. I mean, this is one repellent person performing for his friends. But I don't see that those attitudes are present in his last great poem, Abad, which is one of the thrilling, spiritually desolate poems that I've ever read. So I don't have to share Philip Larkin's opinions to think that Abad is a great poem.
Frank, do you have one more for us?
I do have one more.
So we should let Ed rest.
Before I mention it, I just wanted to say that rather than people tuning out, in fact, your answer prompted the author of the question to come forward and identify herself. Her name is Alyssa Bias. So that's...
Hi, Alyssa. Yeah, we worked together for years.
Great.
Alyssa's one of my dear friends.
So the last question, and it's another mischievous one, is does politics rough up a poem?
I'm not sure what that means. You mean because the subject matter is not pretty?
That could be. That's literally the question is, does politics rough up a poem?
Experience roughs up a poem. I mean, if you decide that poems aren't really all about love, death, and the changing of the seasons, then work, let's say work roughs up a poem. Philip Levine's poems are roughed up about Detroit. Urban grit roughs up a poem. Harlem roughs up a poem. Skokie, where I'm from, roughs up a poem because you don't think Skokie is going to be a setting for a poem. I mean, it's about as unpoetic as you could get as a place. So I think, yes, politics, what's behind the question is that the idea is that there's an approved subject matter for poetry, and that there are certain subjects that are beautiful. And I believe that poetry is a constant trying to widen the idea of what the scope of poetry is. And that poetry keeps challenging the norms of what people think poetry is like. And so if you think that poetry is just about the seasons, someone's going to come along and say it's also about politics. But if you also come along and say poetry is only about politics, someone's going to say, well, actually, poetry is also about God. If you say poetry is only about religion and God, someone's going to come along and say poetry is about housework. Why not? And if someone says poetry is only about housework, someone else is going to say poetry is about same-sex love. I mean, if you want to see a terrific example of that, you should read like Amy Lowell's love poems. There are very surprising ways she used images and repurposed images for the first really great poems of same-sex love. They're not. She has a bad reputation, but those are really good. Those are really good poems. And you might say this was Adrienne Rich's whole project. Let's rough it up. Let's bring it in. Let's bring in daily life. Let's bring in gay experience. Let's bring in women's experience most of all. But she also argued that Anne Bradstreet was doing that, and that American poetry, no one worked in more hazardous conditions than Anne Bradstreet under a stricter situation. So whenever you sort of change the terms of what people think poetry is, the way Anne Bradstreet did, or the way Phyllis Wheatley did, or the way Walt Whitman did, or Emily Dickinson did, then you rough it up. And politics is one way to rough it up. History is one way to rough it up. But so are all kinds of experiences that people think of that are unpoetic. That roughs it up too. And behind this is the premise that people who didn't expect to write poetry rough it up. Working class people rough it up. People of color rough it up. People writing from different sexualities rough it up. I mean, the whole thing is that we're a democracy. And so we have an idea that you can invite, everyone has a place at the table. And so I just think that we need to keep making space at the table. But I would say that there are also formal issues related to this very question, which is the diction roughs it up. The language that you use roughs it up. That is, there's not an approved vocabulary for poetry. And you can find, I happen to like all kinds of subcultures if they find their way into poetry. And one of the exciting things to do as a poet is to find a language that, that seems unpoetic or specialized and using it for poetry. Something seems like that seems unpoetic, say, is the language of sports, which I've used on different occasions to bring into poetry because I hadn't seen poems about football or about basketball that used language in that way. So I would say that the language of poetry needs to keep expanding to the way in which people actually speak. And it keeps changing in the way that people speak, and that roughs up poetry, just the way politics do. I'm all for the roughing up of it.
Eddie, thank you so much for both roughing up poetry for us and
I'm
also
into it.
making room at the table for all of us. Frank, could you invite people to unmute at this point so we could all say hello, say thank you, round of applause, as I see the people being able to do that. And we can change back, Eddie, if you want to gallery view so you can see everybody.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Ed.
Hey,
Thank you.
hi, Jim. Hi, Alyssa. Now I'm seeing my friends. Hi, Alyssa. Hi, Anna.